Hello, friends. Today, we're going to get in trouble. It's time to cause some trouble. We've been way too good lately, and this is a Doom channel. So let's get into trouble and give a shout out, give the spotlight to one of the best Doom bands from America of all time. One of my all-time favorites and definitely one of the best. And this band is not going to be new for most of you. Most of you know this, but there may be a few of you that don't know. And that is the band Trouble, of course. And Trouble was formed way back in the 80s, I believe. Yeah, 1981. In Aurora, Illinois, United States. They were one of the big four with Candlemass, Pentagram, and St. Vitus that really took that Black Sabbath sound and brought it into the 80s and even added some psychedelic and punk mixing to it, but it's very doomy. But the cool thing about Trouble is that they were pretty much the only Christian Doom band. They actually have religious themes to their albums. Their debut is called Psalm 9. It was released in 1984. That's a great album. It's one of their most acclaimed albums, that debut album. But my personal favorite is their 1990 album, their fourth studio album, Trouble. It's just a self-titled. Yeah, it's good. Actually, a masterpiece. Actually, one of my all-time favorite Doom albums ever recorded. Released in February 1990. And good old Eric Wagner, the vocalist, he is one of the best Doom singers ever. This album is a masterpiece, and it's by far the best album Doom-wise of the 90s as far as I'm concerned, and one of the all-time best. It actually was produced by Rick Rubin, the very famous producer, and I don't think they ever topped this album. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a presentation today about the self-titled album. I've written a review of it many years ago. I'll read that. I'll give you a slideshow and talk a bit more about the band, go into a little bit more detail about them. Even though they're probably known by most of you, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't get into a little trouble and give them the spotlight here on my channel. So let's talk about the legends that are still together to this day. Trouble. Thanks for watching. Stay doomed. Alright, thanks for tuning in to my presentation today, covering one of the all-time greatest Doom bands from the United States, and my personal favorite, along with bands like Pentagram and St. Vitus. This is, of course, referring to Trouble, which were formed in the town of Aurora, Illinois in the late 70s. They actually started clear back in 1978 by Rick Wartell. He was in high school and he was the sole guitarist and singer for the band, and they eventually would revamp the lineup in 1981 to be the solid lineup that would record their big albums in the 80s, and they included Bruce Franklin as the guitarist, and of course vocalist Eric Wagner joined, and the rhythm section changed with new bassist Tim Brown and drummer Jeff Olson joining Trouble. They spent the next 2 years in the early 80s honing their skills, defining their signature sound, and they drew from Black Sabbath, Angel Witch, Lucifer's Friend, Deep Purple, bands like that. Took a lot of influence from the new wave of British heavy metal bands. They had a performance in Aurora, Illinois on February 5th, 1983, which was a turning point for them. It was actually a recorded show, and it began to become traded, and Brian Slagle at Metal Blade Records eventually signed the band to the label. He also helped produce their debut album, now known as Psalm 9, which was released in 1984. Now, Psalm 9 was obviously an absolutely classic Doom record, and it's still considered one of the best Doom albums of the 80s for sure. And it's a fantastic Doom album. And then they followed that up with The Skull in 1985, which was kind of a more down-tuned, more psychedelic sounds thrown in as well. But it was a cult album that they actually ended up taking an offshoot band called The Skull, which I'm sure most of you know. Well, they took the name from that album. And it was also another greatly acclaimed Doom album. They followed that up with Run to the Light in 1987, their third album, which is not quite as acclaimed as the previous two albums. And then they had a change in the late 80s. They signed to Rick Rubin's Deaf American Records, and then they recorded the self-titled Trouble album in 1990 with a new drummer, Barry Stern. And this changed the band's sound overall, and they went away from slower Doom, strictly slower Doom type stuff, and they went more psychedelic and hard stoner rock, stoner metal type direction with some Doom undertones as well. And the self-titled album, obviously, as you probably know by now, is my favorite album by the band. I just really took to that album. I don't know what it was, but that album just really, really blew me away. I wrote a review of it in my Facebook group that I'm going to read. It says, I recently got my hands on Trouble's 1990 self-titled album. This bad boy has been put out of print for a while, but is getting reissued soon. Anyway, this album is an absolute heavy metal classic that everyone here should get acquainted with. Released 30 years ago, this album was a seamless bridge between two distinct eras of metal. Here they perfected a potent mix of doom, thrash, and stoner metal, and it blends all these perfectly, and the result is one of the finest metal albums you'll hear. The riffs are huge, and Eric Wagner's vocals soar with grit and grace. They also have the distinction of being one of the only Christian doom bands, and that's a refreshing change from the occult devil worship trope that is often used. So if you haven't heard Trouble, you're in big trouble. Check them out today. My favorite tracks from the album: At the End of My Days, Psychotic Reaction, A Sinner's Fame, The Misery Shows, Rest in Peace, and of course, Black Shapes of Doom. Black Shapes of Doom, obviously, having one of the coolest song titles you'll hear. The first part of the album is especially good, the first half of the album, and the last 3 tracks on the album are not nearly as good as the 7 tracks before, but the 7 tracks before more than make up for any shortcomings at the end of the album. And it's not like the last 3 songs are bad, they're just not as mind-blowingly awesome as the first 7 songs are. Kicking off with At the End of My Days, ass-kicking opening track, The Wolf, again another ass-kicking song. Of course, my favorite section of the album is the middle section here between Psychotic Reaction and Black Shapes of Doom. Track 3 through 7, it really hits the stride with Psychotic Reaction, which is one of the best Trouble songs of all time. A Sinner's Fame is also quite fantastic. And of course, The Misery Shows, a much more mellow type of track that really has this beautiful atmosphere, beautiful guitar playing. Just this very ethereal, just gorgeous sounding song. You really have to hear The Misery Shows. Of course, then it goes into Rest in Peace, which is the prototypical heavy stoner song that has a hell of a catchy chorus, and it's just like an anthem. You know, you can just sing it and pump your fists in the air, and it's just has this really mean sound to it. Rest in Peace is just, that's a song that'll really get caught in your head. It's definitely one of their all-time best songs. And of course, Black Shapes of Doom being again another very catchy song with a great chorus. I like that they have some of their catchiest, most accessible songs on this album, but they still retain that really gritty, heavy, stoner, doomish atmosphere, that stoner, doomish attitude. It's like they took that old Doom garage feel, but they modernized it, they cleaned everything up, cut all the slack off, and just made an album that is one catchy, fantastic peak songwriting after another all the way through the album. So the self-titled album is definitely, my opinion, the one to get if you have to get one Trouble album, but who wants to limit themselves to just one? But it's my personal favorite, and I know I'm not alone in that. It's definitely, along with their debut and their sophomore album, The Skull, those 3 albums are definitely widely considered their best work. Then they, of course, followed that up with Manic Frustration in 1992, which was kind of a continuation of the self-titled album, and it was also on Rick Rubin's label and produced by him as well. I don't like it as much as the self-titled album, but it's still a pretty great album. Now, eventually, Eric Wagner would leave the band. I gotta say, Trouble without Eric Wagner, I'm just not into it. Trouble will always be Eric Wagner's band, and I'm just not very interested in anything without him. And Eric Wagner unfortunately passed away in 2021, and I actually saw a lot of people shit-talking Eric Wagner. There was a lot of trolls and a lot of just disgusting people out there kind of running his name into the ground because he had some stances on the medical industry and on vaccinations, and they were kind of using his death as an example to talk down on people who have his opinions about the medical industry and pharmaceuticals and all this kind of stuff. They were kind of saying like he deserved it. He actually had pneumonia, and they were saying, oh, if he had just gotten vaccinated, he would be fine. I mean, there was a lot of people that were just being absolutely disgusting about the whole thing. Eric Wagner was a great man, and he stood on his principles. He was a man of honor who stood by what he believed in, and he has the right, just like everybody else, to refuse to put anything in his body, just like you have the right to refuse to put anything in your body. We all own our bodies. It was really disgusting, pathetic to see the way people were running his name into the ground when he passed away, but it's just a sign of the times that we live in today, where we've gone to complete clown world. But rest in peace to Eric Wagner. Trouble is still around, and they've still released records with replacement vocalist Kyle Thomas. Of course, Bruce Franklin, the guitar player, who is an amazing guitarist and definitely one of the best parts of Trouble, is still in the band. And Rick Wartell, the original member who formed the band in 1978, is still around. So you have two of the original pieces of the band from the very beginning that are still there. The guitarists are both still there in Trouble to this day. So that's kind of my rundown of Trouble. I'm sure you've all heard this band. This probably isn't telling you anything new, but I just wanted to give this band a shout out. Thanks for listening to my presentation today on Trouble. Go check out especially their self-titled from 1990 if you haven't heard that album, and they have so much great work to dig into. So if all you know is Psalm 9 and The Skull and you haven't heard anything else, their later albums in the 90s, especially the self-titled, is a fantastic record. So go check out their later work as well. Thanks for listening. Doom on. I will talk to you guys soon.